"You're a burden, Mom, and I can't carry you anymore." Those were the words my son Daniel said to me as he stood in the doorway of what used to be my home. His face twisted with something I'd never seen before, disgust. The rain was falling so hard that night I could barely see through it, but I remember every single detail. The way he threw my suitcase into the puddles forming on his driveway, the sound of the door slamming so hard it cracked through the storm, and there I stood at 72 years old, soaked to the bone in my thin cardigan, watching the only home I'd known for the past 3 years disappear behind that closed door. My hands were shaking. Not just from the cold, but from the way my heart seemed to be breaking into pieces so small, I didn't know if they could ever be put back together. I picked up that waterlogged suitcase, felt the weight of everything I still owned in this world, and realized I had absolutely nowhere to go. I never thought my life would come to this moment. When you raise a child, you imagine so many things about how your story together will unfold. But standing homeless in a storm because that child decided you weren't worth the space you occupied. Well, that's a chapter one never saw coming. I'm Margaret, and I'm 72 years old now, though some days I feel ancient and other days I feel like I'm still that young mother who believed love could conquer anything. This is my story, and I'm sharing it with you because I need you to understand that what happened to me could happen to anyone. And what I discovered afterward changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and my own worth. Let me take you back a little so you can understand how I ended up on that driveway. I'd been living with Daniel and his wife Laura for 3 years by then, ever since I sold my small house to help them with their down payment on this bigger, nicer home in the suburbs. They'd said it made sense. Why should I live alone when I was getting older when they had the space when we were family? Seemed like the natural thing to do. I gave them nearly everything I had from selling my house, kept just enough for my basic needs, and moved into the small bedroom at the end of their hallway. I told myself I was being practical, helping my only child build his future, doing what mothers do. But looking back now, I can see all the small moments I ignored, all the tiny cuts that I told myself didn't matter. The way Laura would sigh when I came into the kitchen in the morning, the way Daniel stopped asking about my day after the first few months, how they'd have conversations in low voices that would stop the moment I entered a room, the increasingly frequent comments about how much it cost to keep the heat up, how grocery bills had gone up, how they couldn't go on vacation because they had responsibilities now. Each time I'd make myself smaller, quieter, less of an imposition. I started skipping meals to save them money. I'd wait until they left before I'd use the shower so I wouldn't be in the way. I stopped turning on the lamp in my room because Laura once mentioned the electric bill. I became invisible in increments, you see, long before that rainy night made it official. The day it happened had started like any other. I'd made breakfast for everyone, cleaned up, did some laundry, tried to be helpful without being noticed. Daniel had been tense for weeks. Some trouble at work, I gathered, though he never told me the details anymore. Laura had been even colder than usual, barely looking at me when I asked if she needed anything from the store. I remember feeling this tightness in my chest all day, this knowing that something was coming, but I pushed it down the way I'd learned to push down so many feelings. Then evening came and everything shattered. Daniel came home from work with this look on his face, jaw clenched, eyes hard. Laura was right behind him, and I could tell they'd been talking about something, planning something. I was in the living room, reading a library book, trying to be invisible as usual, when Daniel just stood there in front of me and said we needed to talk. My heart started racing before he even began speaking, because I knew that tone. It was the same tone he'd used when he was 16 and told me he'd wrecked my car. That blend of defensiveness and determination that meant he'd already made up his mind and nothing I said would matter. He told me I needed to leave. Not in a week, not next month, immediately that very night. He said they needed their space back, that having me there was putting too much strain on their marriage, that I was costing them too much money, that at my age I should have planned better for myself instead of becoming their problem. Laura stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding along like I was some kind of pest they'd finally decided to exterminate. I tried to speak, tried to ask where I was supposed to go, tried to remind him that I'd given them everything I had to help with this house, but my voice came out so small and broken that it didn't seem to matter. That's when he called me a burden. Not in anger really, that's what hurt most, but in this cold, matter-of-fact way, like he was just stating an obvious truth he'd finally accepted. Laura went and got my suitcase, the one I'd moved in with 3 years ago, and started throwing my things into it, Not even folding anything, just shoving clothes and books and photographs in like trash she couldn't wait to be rid of. I sat there frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to make my body move. When the suitcase was packed, Daniel picked it up and walked toward the front door. I followed him in a daze, still thinking maybe this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding, maybe he'd stop and apologize, maybe he'd remember who I was and what I'd done for him his entire life. But he opened that door to the pouring rain and just threw the suitcase out into it, and when I didn't move fast enough, he took my arm, not roughly but firmly, and guided me to the threshold. The last thing he said before he closed the door was that I'd figure something out, that I always did. Then I was alone in the storm. I don't know how long I stood there in that driveway, rain soaking through every layer of clothing I had on, before my body finally remembered how to move. The shock was so complete, so total, that I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. This elderly woman clutching a wet suitcase, shivering in the darkness with nowhere to go and no one to call. My phone was in my pocket, but who would I reach out to? I'd lost touch with most of my friends over the years, slowly and without really noticing. When you spend decades pouring everything into your child, into being the mother you think you're supposed to be, other relationships just seem to fade into the background. I had a few acquaintances from the senior center I used to volunteer at before I moved in with Daniel, but none of them were close enough to call at 10 o'clock at night asking for shelter. My sister Elena lived 3 states away, and we hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. That distance between us was my fault, really. Elena had always been the strong one, the successful one, the sister who built her own life and didn't apologize for it. She'd never married, never had children, focused instead on her career in real estate development. She'd done well for herself, very well, but I'd always felt this strange awkwardness around her success, like it highlighted everything I hadn't accomplished. When she'd call, I'd find myself making excuses, keeping conversations short, telling her everything was fine even when it wasn't. The last time we'd spoken, she'd asked pointed questions about my living situation with Daniel, and I'd gotten defensive, told her she didn't understand what it meant to be a mother, to sacrifice for your child. She'd gone quiet after that, and when we hung up, neither of us called back. Pride is a terrible thing, I've learned. It keeps you from reaching out until it's too late. So I walked instead, dragging that suitcase behind me, not knowing where I was going but knowing I couldn't stand in Daniel's driveway forever. The streets of his neighborhood were quiet and dark, all those nice houses with their lights glowing warm behind curtains, families inside doing normal evening things, watching television, washing dishes, existing in their safe, dry worlds. I felt like a ghost moving past all that normalness, invisible and unreal. My clothes were plastered to my skin, my shoes squelching with every step, and my mind kept circling back to the same question. How did I get here? I'd given that boy everything. When his father left us, Daniel was only 8 years old then, I'd worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, to make sure he never felt like he was missing anything. I'd stayed up late helping with homework even when I could barely keep my eyes open. I'd skipped meals so he could have seconds. I'd worn the same coat for 10 winters so he could have new clothes for school. I'd cheered at every baseball game, attended every parent-teacher conference, celebrated every small victory like it was the most important thing in the world. And when he grew up and got married, I'd been so happy for him, so proud, so ready to step back and let him build his own life. But apparently I'd stepped back right into being disposable. I ended up under a highway overpass around midnight, finally too exhausted to walk any further. There were a few other people already there, huddled in sleeping bags and blankets, eyes watching me with a mixture of sympathy and wariness that comes from knowing how quickly you can fall from one world into another. I found a dry spot against the concrete pillar, sat down with my back against it, and pulled my suitcase close like it was something precious. The sound of cars rushing overhead was constant, a mechanical roar that somehow felt less lonely than the silence of being unwanted. I didn't cry at first. I think I was too shocked, too numb, too busy trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as the night wore on and the cold seeped deeper into my bones, the tears finally came. They came quietly at first, then harder until I was sobbing into my hands like a child, grieving for everything I'd lost. Not just a home, but the image I'd held of my son, of our relationship, of my worth as a mother and a human being. All those years of sacrifice suddenly felt meaningless, like I'd been building a house on sand and never noticed how unstable the foundation was. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the fear of what would happen to me. The worst part was the crushing realization that the person I'd loved most in this world had looked at me and seen only a burden. That word kept echoing in my head. Burden, burden, burden. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhausted from crying and shivering, I must have dozed off despite the cold and the noise and the complete wrongness of everything. I remember closing my eyes and thinking that maybe I wouldn't wake up, that maybe this was just how my story would end. Alone under a bridge, forgotten, erased from the lives I'd spent so much time trying to be essential to. But then I heard my name. It came through the fog of half-sleep like something from a dream, soft, urgent, familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. I opened my eyes to find a figure standing in front of me, backlit by streetlights, and for a confused moment I thought maybe I was hallucinating. But then she knelt down and I saw her face clearly, and my heart nearly stopped. Elena. My sister was there at 4 in the morning under a highway overpass, looking at me with tears streaming down her face and an expression I'd never seen before. Something beyond anger, beyond pity, something that looked like pure protective fury mixed with heartbreak. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say I told you so. She just put her arms around me, and I felt warmth for the first time in hours, and I started crying all over again because I couldn't understand how she was there. How she'd found me, how she'd known. Later, she would tell me that Daniel had called her. Not out of concern. He'd called to let her know he'd finally done what needed to be done, gotten rid of the burden, freed himself from the responsibility. He'd actually expected her to thank him, to understand his position. Instead, Elena had gotten in her car immediately and driven through the night, calling every hospital and shelter in his city, searching until she found me. The rage in her voice when she told me about that phone call was something fierce and beautiful, like she was channeling all the anger I should have felt but couldn't quite access yet. She helped me to my feet, picked up my soaked suitcase and led me to her car. Inside, she had blankets, hot coffee and a thermos, dry clothes she'd grabbed from her apartment before starting the drive. She wrapped me up, turned the heat on full blast, and just sat there with me while I shook and cried and tried to form words that kept dissolving before I could speak them. She told me I was coming home with her, that I'd stay as long as I needed, that I was safe now. And I believed her because Elena had always been the kind of person who meant what she said. As we drove away from that overpass, away from Daniel's city, I watched the sunrise start to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was strange, that sunrise. Beautiful and terrible at the same time, because it meant I'd survived the worst night of my life, but it also meant I had to face what came next. A future I'd never imagined, a life I'd have to rebuild from nothing, and the knowledge that my relationship with my son was broken in ways I didn't know if I could ever repair. Elena drove in silence mostly, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand, and I stared out the window and wondered who I was supposed to be now that I wasn't Daniel's mother anymore. Not in the way I'd always understood that role, anyway. The woman who'd woken up yesterday morning in that small bedroom at the end of the hallway, making breakfast and doing laundry and trying so hard to be worth the space she occupied, she was gone now. And I didn't know yet who I was supposed to become in her place. Elena's apartment was in a quiet coastal town I'd never visited before, 3 states away from the life I'd known. When we arrived that morning, exhausted and emotionally hollowed out, she led me inside and showed me to a guest room that felt almost too comfortable, too welcoming for someone like me. Clean white sheets, soft pillows, a window that looked out over rooftops toward a sliver of ocean in the distance. She told me to rest, that we'd talk later, that I didn't need to worry about anything right now. I slept for 14 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes after your body has finally decided it's safe enough to let go. When I woke up, I could smell coffee and something baking. I found Elena in the kitchen, pulling a tray of blueberry muffins from the oven, the same recipe our mother used to make when we were children. She saw me standing in the doorway and smiled, but there was something behind that smile, something nervous and determined that I couldn't quite read. She poured me coffee, set a warm muffin in front of me, and sat down across the table with her hands wrapped around her own mug, studying me in that direct way she'd always had. She asked me how long it had been going on. Not just the throwing me out part, but all of it, the small cruelties, the making myself invisible, the slow erasure of my dignity and worth. I tried to downplay it at first, old habits dying hard, but Elena had this way of looking at you that made lying impossible. So I told her everything. about selling my house and giving Daniel the money, about the comments and the sighs and the careful budgeting of my existence, about how I'd convinced myself that being small and quiet and undemanding was the same thing as being loved. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me she'd known something was wrong for years, that she'd tried to reach out, tried to ask questions, but I'd always shut her down. She said she'd watched me disappear into motherhood, the way some people disappear into addiction, pouring everything into Daniel until there was nothing left of the sister she'd grown up with. And she said she'd spent the last 2 years since our last painful phone call preparing for this exact moment, not because she'd wished for it, but because she'd seen it coming and wanted to be ready. That's when she told me about the condominium. She got up from the table and came back with a folder full of papers, legal documents with my name on them, and she spread them out in front of me with hands that were shaking slightly. 6 months ago, she explained, she'd purchased a beautiful 2-bedroom condominium in this very town, right on the ocean, with a balcony that faced the sunrise and enough space for a whole library of books. She'd paid for it in full, no mortgage, no debt, and she'd put it entirely in my name. I stared at those papers and couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Elena kept talking, her words tumbling out faster now, like she'd been holding them in for so long and finally had permission to release them. She told me about the savings account she'd opened in my name, about the investments she'd made on my behalf over the past several years, about the financial cushion she'd been quietly building so that I'd never have to depend on anyone ever again. The numbers on those bank statements made my head spin, millions of dollars, sitting there with my name on them, money I'd never earned or asked for or even known existed. I asked her why. Why would she do this, spend this kind of money, make these preparations for someone who'd pushed her away and dismissed her concerns? Elena's eyes filled with tears then, and she reached across the table to take my hands in hers. She told me that I was her sister, that she'd watched our mother sacrifice herself the same way I'd been doing, that she'd promised herself she'd never let me end up alone and destitute the way our mother almost had. She said that love didn't stop just because someone pushed you away, and that she'd been waiting for the day when I'd be ready to accept help. That day had come sooner and more brutally than either of us had wanted. The condominium was ready for me to move into immediately, she said. Fully furnished, utilities set up, everything I'd need to start fresh. She'd been keeping it as a rental property waiting just in case. And now it was mine, not hers, not ours, but solely and legally mine. No one could take it from me. No one could use it as leverage. No one could make me feel like I was a burden for existing in a space that belonged to me. I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. All I could do was cry, but these tears were different from the ones I'd shed under that bridge. These were tears of disbelief, of gratitude so overwhelming I didn't know how to hold it, of grief for all the years I'd wasted pushing away the one person who'd actually been preparing to catch me when I fell. Elena cried too, and we sat there at her kitchen table, holding hands across the scattered legal documents that represented a future I'd never imagined possible. She took me to see it that afternoon. The condominium was 10 minutes from her apartment, in a building right on the waterfront with its own private beach access. We rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, and Elena unlocked the door to Unit 304. And I stepped inside and felt something in my chest crack open. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean. Soft afternoon light poured across hardwood floors. The furniture was elegant but comfortable. Overstuffed chairs perfect for reading, a dining table big enough for company, a kitchen with gleaming countertops and everything you could possibly need. But it was the bedroom that made me completely break down. Elena had decorated it with things she remembered I loved. A quilt in shades of blue and cream, bookshelves already filled with classics and new releases, a reading chair positioned by the window with a view of the water. On the nightstand was a framed photograph I recognized immediately. Elena and me as children, maybe 7 and 5 years old, holding hands on a beach somewhere, laughing at something outside the frame. She'd kept that photograph all these years, and now she'd placed it here, in this room that was mine, as if to say, "This is who you were before you forgot, and this is who you can be again." I sat on the edge of that bed and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The grief of what Daniel had done. The shock of Elena's incredible generosity. The terror of starting over at 72. The tiny, fragile spark of something that might have been hope. Elena sat beside me and put her arm around my shoulders, And we stayed like that until the sun started setting over the ocean, painting everything gold and pink and promising. She told me I could move in whenever I was ready. Tomorrow, next week, next month, it didn't matter. The place was mine, and I could take all the time I needed to adjust to this new reality. But there was something else too, she said, something she wanted me to think about carefully. She believed I had more to offer the world than just being Daniel's discarded mother. She thought I had wisdom, experience, and strength that other women in similar situations desperately needed to see. She suggested I might want to consider using some of the money she'd given me to start a foundation, something to help other elderly women who'd been abandoned or abused or made to feel invisible. I thought she was crazy at first. What did I know about running a foundation? What could I possibly offer anyone when I'd just been rescued from sleeping under a bridge? But Elena shook her head and said that was exactly the point. I understood what it felt like to be discarded, to have your worth measured only by what you could provide to others, to believe you deserved to be small and quiet and grateful for scraps. That understanding, she said, was worth more than any degree or credential when it came to helping women who needed to know they weren't alone. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly I couldn't think beyond the next day. We went back to her apartment that evening, and I helped her make dinner, something simple, pasta and salad, and we ate together at her little kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with Daniel or abandonment or foundations. We talked about books and movies and the stray cat that came to Elena's balcony every morning. We talked like sisters, like friends, like two women who'd found their way back to each other after too many years apart. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like maybe I wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe, just maybe, I was being offered the chance to actually live. I moved into the condominium 2 weeks later, on a bright Tuesday morning that felt almost surreal in its ordinariness. Elena helped me unpack the few belongings I had. Clothes that had been rescued from that waterlogged suitcase, some books, a handful of photographs. It didn't take long. My entire life fit into 3 boxes and 2 shopping bags, which should have been depressing but somehow felt liberating instead. I was starting fresh with almost nothing, which meant I could decide who to become without the weight of accumulated possessions telling me who I used to be. The first morning I woke up in that ocean view bedroom, I lay there for almost an hour just listening to the sound of waves and trying to convince myself this was real. I started building small routines. Coffee on the balcony at sunrise, walks on the beach in the afternoon, reading in the evening with the windows open so I could hear the ocean. Elena visited often, sometimes just to sit with me in comfortable silence, other times to gently push me toward thinking about the foundation she'd suggested. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I was beginning to feel something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace, of belonging to myself rather than existing as an extension of someone else's needs. Then 3 weeks after I moved in, Daniel called. I almost didn't answer. His name on my phone screen made my hands shake and my stomach twist into knots. But some part of me, the part that had been his mother for 44 years, couldn't quite ignore him. So I answered, and I heard his voice for the first time since he'd called me a burden and thrown me into the rain. He sounded cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened. He asked how I was doing, where I was staying, if I'd found a place yet. His tone was light, conversational, as if we were just catching up after a normal period of not talking rather than after he'd made me homeless. I told him I was fine, that I was living in a condominium now, that I was safe. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then his voice changed, became more interested, more focused. He wanted to know more about this condominium. How could I afford it? Was I renting? Did I need help with anything? I could hear what he wasn't saying underneath all those questions. I kept my answers vague, told him a friend had helped me out, changed the subject. But Daniel didn't let it drop. He kept circling back, kept asking questions, and finally he said he'd like to come visit to see where I was living to make sure I was really okay. He said he'd been worried about me, that he'd regretted how things ended, that maybe they'd been too hasty that night. Laura had been stressed, he explained, and they'd both said things they didn't mean in the heat of the moment. I told him I needed time. He said he understood, but I could hear the persistence in his voice. Elena was furious when I told her about the call. She said Daniel had somehow found out I wasn't destitute anymore, that his sudden interest wasn't concern but calculation. I wanted to believe she was wrong, wanted to think maybe my son was genuinely feeling guilty and wanted to make amends. But then he called again 2 days later. And then Laura called. And then Daniel sent flowers to my building, Expensive ones with a card that said, "Thinking of you, Mom," in handwriting that wasn't his. They started showing up a week later. I don't know how they got my address, but there they were one Saturday afternoon, standing in the lobby of my building, calling up to ask if they could come see me. My first instinct was to refuse, but that old maternal guilt kicked in. What kind of mother turns away her child? And before I could stop myself, I'd buzzed them up. The moment they walked into my condominium, I saw their eyes taking inventory. They looked at the ocean view, the nice furniture, the spacious rooms, and I could practically see them calculating the value of it all. Daniel hugged me, but it felt performative, mechanical. Laura smiled and complimented the place and asked leading questions about how much the building fees were, whether I owned it or rented it, what the real estate market was like in this area. They stayed for an hour, and the entire time I felt like I was being assessed rather than visited. Before they left, Daniel suggested we have dinner together soon, maybe once a week, so we could rebuild our relationship. He said family was important, that they'd made a mistake, that they wanted me back in their lives. Laura nodded along, touching my arm with what was supposed to be affection, but felt more like someone staking a claim. I said I'd think about it, and they left with promises to call soon, to stay in touch, to be better. After they were gone, I sat on my balcony and felt sick to my stomach. Elena came over that evening and found me still sitting there, watching the sun set over the water. I told her about the visit, about how wrong it had all felt, about how I couldn't shake the sense that they wanted something from me. She sat down beside me and was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Daniel had called her several times in the past week, asking questions about me, about my finances, about whether she'd given me money. She'd refused to tell him anything, and he'd gotten angry, accused her of turning me against him. That's when the gifts started arriving. Expensive things, a cashmere sweater, a set of china, a tablet computer still in its box. Each one came with a note from Daniel and Laura, little messages about how they wanted to take care of me, how they'd been thinking about what I might need. I didn't want any of it, but returning the gifts felt churlish, ungrateful, like I was being the difficult one. So they accumulated in my spare bedroom, unopened boxes that felt more like obligations than presents. Then Daniel started bringing papers when he visited. He came by one afternoon with Laura, and after the usual small talk, he pulled out some documents and suggested I might want to set up a power of attorney, just in case anything happened to me. He said at my age, it was important to have someone who could make decisions on my behalf if I became ill or incapacitated. He'd already had his lawyer draw up the paperwork, he said. All I needed to do was sign. I told him I'd need to think about it, to have my own lawyer look at it first. His expression changed then. Just for a moment I saw frustration flash across his face before he smoothed it away and said, of course, that was smart, that I should definitely get legal advice. But the way he looked at those papers as he put them back in his briefcase, the tightness around his mouth, it confirmed everything Elena had been warning me about. They didn't want a relationship with me. They wanted access to what I had. The visits became more frequent after that, more insistent. Daniel would show up unannounced with takeout food, settle himself on my couch, and stay for hours talking about his financial struggles, the mortgage payments, the credit card debt, how hard it was to get ahead in this economy. Laura would call and mention things they needed. A new car, home repairs, medical bills. Never quite asking directly, but leaving heavy pauses where I was supposed to offer help. And every time there were more papers, different forms, different requests, joint bank accounts for easier money transfers, investment opportunities they wanted me to consider, documents about estate planning and beneficiaries that just happened to list Daniel as the primary inheritor of everything I owned. I signed nothing. Each time I refused, the warmth would drain from their faces a little more. The visits would end a little more abruptly. The phone calls would carry a sharper edge. Daniel started bringing up the past, how much he'd sacrificed to take me in, how I'd been a financial burden on them, how ungrateful I was being now that the situation had reversed. Laura would add comments about how family was supposed to help each other, how strange it was that I'd trust strangers more than my own son. The manipulation was so constant, so relentless, that I started doubting myself. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe they really did just want to help. Maybe I was punishing Daniel for one terrible mistake instead of letting him make amends. The old patterns were so deeply ingrained, the need to believe the best of him, to justify his behavior, to blame myself for expecting too much. But then Elena introduced me to Sophia. Sophia was a lawyer who specialized in elder law and financial protection. Elena had asked her to meet with me, just to review my situation and make sure everything was properly secured. I was resistant at first. It felt like admitting my son was a threat, which seemed like a betrayal of everything motherhood was supposed to mean. But Elena insisted, and something in me was tired enough of the constant pressure that I agreed. That meeting changed everything. Sophia sat across from me in her office, reviewed the papers Daniel had been bringing me, and her expression grew darker with each document she examined. Then she looked up at me with a directness that reminded me of Elena, and asked if I understood what I would have been signing. I admitted I didn't, not really. So she explained. The power of attorney would have given Daniel complete control over all my finances and medical decisions. The joint bank account paperwork would have allowed him to withdraw funds without my permission. The estate planning documents would have transferred ownership of my condominium and all my assets to him immediately upon my death, with provisions that would have made it nearly impossible for me to change my mind later. If I had signed those papers, Sophia said quietly, I would have essentially given away everything Elena had secured for me. I sat there in her office feeling cold all over, realizing how close I'd come to walking right back into captivity. Not the obvious kind where someone throws you out in the rain, but the quieter kind, where they smile and call you mom while systematically stripping away your autonomy and worth. Sophia asked me what I wanted to do, and for the first time since Daniel had called me a burden, I felt something sharp and clear and unmistakably mine rise up in my chest. I told her I wanted protection. I wanted boundaries. I wanted to make sure that no one, not my son, not anyone, could ever make me feel powerless again. She smiled then and said she could help me with that. Sophia worked fast and she worked thoroughly. Within 2 weeks, she'd set up legal structures around my assets that were more secure than anything I'd imagined possible. Trusts with independent trustees. Medical directives that specified exactly who could and couldn't make decisions on my behalf. Legal documents that explicitly revoked any informal agreements or assumptions about inheritance. She explained everything to me in language I could understand, making sure I knew exactly what each signature meant, what each protection accomplished. But more than that, she taught me something I'd never really learned, that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. I also did something else on Sophia's recommendation. I started documenting everything. Every visit from Daniel and Laura, every phone call, every request for money or signatures. I kept a journal with dates and times and exact quotes as best as I could remember them. Sophia said it might seem excessive, but in her experience, when people were determined to get what they wanted, they often escalated. And if they escalated, I'd need proof of the pattern. I didn't want to believe my son would escalate, but I'd also never imagined he'd throw me out in a storm. Elena suggested I use this time to think seriously about the foundation she'd mentioned. Not as a distraction, but as a purpose, something to pour my energy into that would matter beyond my own small circle of pain. I was still hesitant, still feeling like I had nothing valuable to offer. But she kept gently pushing, and finally one afternoon she brought over a stack of letters. They were from women who'd contacted a local senior center after hearing about my story. Elena had mentioned it to a friend who worked there, and word had spread. These women wrote about their own experiences, being pushed out by children who wanted their homes, being isolated by family members who controlled their finances, being made to feel invisible, worthless, too old to matter. Letter after letter from women who thought they were alone in their suffering, who'd never told anyone because they were ashamed or scared or convinced it was somehow their fault. I read those letters and cried for every single one of them, and then I called Sophia and asked her to help me set up a foundation. We'd call it the Clara Monroe Foundation after my mother, who'd spent her final years dependent on relatives who treated her as an obligation rather than a person. The foundation would provide legal assistance, temporary housing support, counseling services, and financial education for elderly women escaping abusive or exploitative family situations. It would be quiet work, unglamorous work, but it would be real. Setting it up gave me something I'd been missing. A reason to wake up that had nothing to do with surviving or hiding or processing my own pain. Meanwhile, Daniel's visits became more aggressive. He'd show up without calling first, sometimes with Laura, sometimes alone. He'd walk through my condominium like he was inspecting it, make comments about how much space I had for just one person, suggest I might want to sell and move into something smaller, invest the difference. When I mentioned the foundation I was starting, his eyes lit up in a way that made my skin crawl. He started asking questions about the foundation's finances, offering to help manage the money, suggesting he could be on the board of directors. I told him the board positions were already filled. Elena, Sophia, and two other women I'd met through the senior center who'd survived similar situations. I watched his face close down when I said that, saw the calculation behind his eyes. He asked how much money I was putting into this foundation, whether I'd thought about what would happen to those funds if something happened to me, whether I was really sure I wanted to give away my security to strangers. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything. The conversation deteriorated from there. Daniel's tone shifted from concern to accusatory. He said Elena was poisoning me against him, that I was being manipulated by people who didn't really care about me, that I was betraying my own family for the sake of strangers who'd never sacrificed for me the way he had. Laura jumped in, her voice sharp and wounded, talking about how hurt they were, how they tried so hard to make things right, how ungrateful I was being. I asked them to leave. They didn't want to, but I stood my ground and eventually they went. After that, things got worse. Daniel started calling at all hours, early morning, late at night, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to angry to vaguely threatening. He'd say things like, "You're making a huge mistake, and you're going to regret pushing me away, and don't forget who took care of you when no one else would." The irony of that last one would have been funny if it hadn't been so disturbing. Then the lawyers got involved on his end. Daniel hired an attorney who sent me a letter claiming I was mentally incompetent and shouldn't be making financial decisions without family oversight. The letter suggested I submit to a competency evaluation and implied that if I didn't, they'd pursue legal conservatorship. I was terrified when I first read it, convinced that somehow they could really take away my autonomy, prove I was too old or too confused to manage my own life. Sophia was unfazed. She'd seen this tactic before. She arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist, someone completely independent, with impeccable credentials. The evaluation took 3 hours and covered everything from my memory to my decision-making capacity to my understanding of my finances. When the results came back, they were conclusive. I was fully competent, cognitively sharp, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Sophia sent that evaluation to Daniel's lawyer along with a formal cease and desist letter. But Daniel didn't stop. He showed up at the building where the foundation was setting up its office, demanding to speak with me, causing a scene in the lobby until security escorted him out. He contacted Elena at her workplace, harassing her about turning me against my own family. He even tried to access my medical records at a local clinic, claiming he was concerned about my health. Every action was documented. Every violation was recorded. Then he went too far. He forged my signature on a document claiming I'd agreed to transfer ownership of the condominium to him, and he submitted it to the county recorder's office. It was a clumsy forgery. The signature didn't match, the notarization was fake, but it was criminal fraud nonetheless. Sophia discovered it during a routine check of public records. She immediately filed a police report and began the process of having the fraudulent document voided. More importantly, she compiled everything we'd been documenting: the harassment, the manipulation attempts, the forged signature, into a comprehensive legal complaint. The foundation was officially registered as a nonprofit now, which meant the attempted fraud extended to trying to steal from a charitable organization. That made it a more serious crime than just a family dispute over property. I didn't want to press charges. Even after everything, some part of me balked at the idea of my son facing criminal consequences. But Sophia explained something crucial. This wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. If I didn't draw a clear legal line now, Daniel would keep escalating. He'd already proven he was willing to commit fraud. What would he try next? Elena sat with me while I made the decision. She didn't push, didn't tell me what to do, just held my hand and reminded me that being a mother didn't mean accepting abuse. That loving someone didn't require letting them destroy you. That sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to participate in someone's destructive behavior. I authorized Sophia to move forward with everything: the fraud complaint, the restraining order petition, the criminal referral. And then I did something I'd never done before. I stopped waiting for Daniel to change. Stopped hoping he'd suddenly realize what he'd done and become the son I'd always imagined he could be. I accepted that the boy I'd raised and the man he'd become were two different people, and I couldn't save him from the consequences of his own choices. Instead, I focused on the foundation. We'd found a small office space, hired our first staff member, a social worker named Patricia who'd spent 30 years in elder services, and started reaching out to the women who'd written those letters. One by one they came to our office. One by one they shared their stories. And one by one, we helped them find lawyers, safe housing, financial advisors who specialized in untangling complicated family situations. I met a woman named Dorothy who was 81 and had been living in her daughter's basement, doing all the housework and childcare in exchange for a room without heat and one meal a day. We helped her find an apartment and apply for benefits she'd never known she was entitled to. I met a woman named Grace whose son had stolen her identity and ruined her credit, leaving her unable to rent anywhere. We connected her with a lawyer who specialized in identity theft and helped her begin the long process of restoration. I met a woman named Helen who believed she deserved to be treated poorly because she was old and no longer useful. We sat together over tea and I told her my story, and I watched her cry and then slowly, tentatively start to believe she might deserve better. Each woman I helped felt like a small redemption for all the years I'd spent teaching myself to be small. The foundation became my purpose, my passion, my proof that the worst thing that had ever happened to me could be transformed into something meaningful. Elena worked alongside me, managing the financial side while I focused on outreach and direct service. Sophia volunteered her legal expertise pro bono, teaching workshops on estate planning and protecting yourself from financial exploitation. We weren't changing the world, but we were changing worlds, one elderly woman at a time. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, all that purpose, all that slow transformation, I realized I was happy. Not in the carefree way of someone who'd never been hurt, but in the deeper way of someone who'd been broken and had chosen to build something new from the pieces. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before Daniel was born. I joined a book club at the local library. I made friends with my neighbors. I planted herbs in pots on my balcony and watched them grow. I became, slowly and sometimes painfully, my own person again. The court date arrived on a Thursday morning in late spring, almost 6 months after that rainy night under the highway overpass. I woke up early and stood on my balcony watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of copper and rose, and I felt strangely calm. Sophia had prepared me thoroughly for what to expect: the formal proceedings, the evidence presentation, the likelihood that Daniel would try one last manipulation. Elena was coming with me, and so was Patricia from the foundation. I wouldn't be alone. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit Elena had helped me pick out. Not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel like myself, put together, clear-minded, unshakable. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror wasn't the same one who'd stood shivering in the rain 6 months ago. She had the same face, the same gray hair, the same 72 years of living. But her eyes were different now. Steadier. Certain. The courthouse was downtown, an imposing building with marble floors and high ceilings that made voices echo. Daniel and Laura were already there with their lawyer when we arrived. I saw him across the lobby, and for just a moment our eyes met. I waited for the familiar pull, the maternal instinct to go to him, to fix things, to make peace at any cost. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness mixed with acceptance. He'd made his choices, I'd made mine, and we were both going to live with the consequences. The hearing itself was surprisingly straightforward. Sophia presented the evidence of fraud, the forged signature, the fake notarization, the attempted transfer of property that belonged to me. She showed the pattern of harassment and manipulation, the documented phone calls and unwanted visits. She presented the psychiatric evaluation proving my mental competency. She explained about the foundation, about the attempted theft from a registered nonprofit organization. Daniel's lawyer tried to frame it as a family misunderstanding, a son worried about his aging mother's welfare. But when Sophia presented the actual forged document side by side with samples of my real signature, even his lawyer seemed to deflate. There was no explaining away something that obvious, that calculated. The judge was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the evidence carefully, asked pointed questions, and listened to Daniel's lawyer's arguments with polite skepticism. Then she asked if Daniel wanted to make a statement. He stood up, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, uncertain, searching for the right words to make things go his way. But when he started speaking, I heard only excuses. He talked about how hard it had been to have me living with them, how much stress I'd caused in his marriage, how he'd only been trying to protect his family's interests. He said the signature wasn't really forged, just signed by him on my behalf because he'd assumed I'd want him to handle it. He said I'd been confused lately, making poor decisions, giving away money to strangers when my own family needed help. I listened to him rewrite history in real time, turning himself into the victim and me into the problem. The judge let him finish, then asked if I wanted to respond. Sophia had prepared a statement, but in that moment I decided to speak from my heart instead. I stood up, and my voice was steady when I addressed the court. I said I didn't want revenge or punishment. I just wanted protection. I wanted legal boundaries that my son couldn't cross, couldn't manipulate, couldn't explain away. I wanted the right to live my life without fear of losing my home or my autonomy to someone who'd already proven he valued my assets more than my dignity. And I wanted the foundation to be protected so it could continue helping women who were still standing in the rain, still believing they deserved to be discarded. When I sat down, the judge was quiet for a long moment. Then she delivered her ruling. The fraudulent document was void and would be permanently expunged from public records. Daniel was ordered to cease all contact with me except through legal counsel. A restraining order was granted, requiring him to stay at least 500 feet from my home, my office, and any foundation events. The evidence of fraud was being referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. And then the judge said something I'll never forget. She looked directly at Daniel and told him that throwing a parent away when they became inconvenient, then trying to exploit them when they gained resources, wasn't just morally reprehensible. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds. She said his actions had consequences, and those consequences were his to bear. Daniel's face went white. Laura started crying. Their lawyer shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. I felt nothing but a deep, quiet relief. We left the courthouse into bright spring sunshine. Elena hugged me tight, and Patricia was beaming, and Sophia looked satisfied in that professional way lawyers have when justice actually works the way it's supposed to. We went to lunch at a little cafe overlooking the water, and we toasted with iced tea to boundaries and second chances and women who refused to stay broken. That evening, I walked on the beach alone and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The truth was, I'd spent so much of my life believing that being needed was the same thing as being loved. I'd measured my worth by how much I could sacrifice, how small I could make myself, how uncomplainingly I could serve. And when that stopped being enough, when I became more burden than benefit, I'd learned the devastating truth. That kind of love was conditional, transactional, hollow at its core. But I'd also learned something else. Real love, the kind Elena had shown me, the kind Sophia and Patricia and the women at the foundation were teaching me, didn't require you to disappear. It didn't demand you give up everything to prove you were worthy of basic human dignity. Real love made space for you to exist. The foundation grew steadily over the following months. We helped 30 women in our first year, providing legal aid, housing support, counseling, and financial planning. Each success felt personal, like I was saving a version of myself over and over again. We held workshops and support groups. We trained volunteers. We built a community of women who'd been told they were too old to matter, and we proved that story was a lie. I never heard from Daniel again directly. I learned through mutual acquaintances that the district attorney had decided not to pursue criminal charges. There wasn't enough evidence of intent beyond the civil fraud, apparently. Part of me was relieved. Part of me recognized that he'd escaped serious consequences once again. But it didn't matter anymore whether he learned his lesson or not. What mattered was that he couldn't hurt me anymore. I gave away the last of the things he'd given me over the years. The gifts from those manipulation visits, stored in my spare bedroom. I donated them to a women's shelter. Let them become useful to someone who needed them. Clearing them out felt like shedding the last piece of a skin that no longer fit. Elena and I grew closer than we'd ever been. We had dinner together twice a week, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. We talked about our childhood, about our mother, about all the years we'd wasted being distant. We forgave each other for old wounds and built something new on top of the old foundation. She told me once that saving me had saved her too, had given her a purpose beyond just accumulating wealth, had reminded her what family could be when it was chosen rather than obligated. I started a small garden on my balcony. Nothing elaborate, just tomatoes and herbs and some flowers that attracted butterflies. I liked the metaphor of it, planting things I might not see fully mature, tending growth that would continue after I was gone. The foundation felt like that too. Seeds planted for a harvest I wouldn't entirely witness. On the anniversary of that rainy night, I woke up early and walked down to the beach before sunrise. I stood at the water's edge and thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, homeless, heartbroken, convinced her life was over. I thought about all the moments between then and now, all the small choices to keep going, to accept help, to believe I deserved better. I thought about Daniel and let myself grieve one final time for the relationship we'd never have, for the son who existed only in my imagination. And then I let it go, released it into the waves and watched it dissolve into foam and salt water. The sun rose while I stood there, painting everything gold and new, and I felt something I'd been searching for without knowing it. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper. Wholeness. The sense that I was enough just as I was, without needing to prove it through sacrifice or service or making myself small enough to fit into someone else's life. I was 72 years old and I was just beginning. I walked back to my condominium as the beach filled with morning joggers and dog walkers and other early risers. I made coffee and sat on my balcony with a book I'd been meaning to read. Later, I'd go to the foundation office and meet with a new client. Elena was coming for dinner. I had a life now, not the one I'd imagined when I was young, not the one I'd tried to build through motherhood, but one that was entirely mine. And that was everything. If you're listening to this and you're wondering if it's too late for you, if you've been made to feel invisible or burdensome or past your usefulness, I want you to know something. Age doesn't erase your power. Silence doesn't mean surrender. And the people who try to discard you don't get to define your worth. You get to define that yourself. I learned that the hard way, standing in the rain with nowhere to go. But I learned it. And if an old woman like me can rebuild her entire life at 72, can draw boundaries she never imagined drawing, can transform her worst betrayal into her greatest purpose, then anyone can. The line I drew in the sand that day in court wasn't just about protecting myself from Daniel. It was about declaring to the world and to myself that I mattered, that my dignity wasn't negotiable, that I had every right to exist fully and unapologetically in whatever space I claimed as mine. That line is still there, unbroken and immovable. And I'm still here too, on the other side of it, living a life I never dared to imagine was possible. Planting gardens, helping women, watching sunrises, being enough, just being enough.